Hello again and happy and blessed Thursday from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. In this video, I'm going to discuss, maybe at length, South Africa's multiracial democracy. It emerged nearly 25 years ago because in the last week of April 1994, the first multiracial democratic parliamentary elections were held, and in early May 1994, the newly elected parliament unanimously chose the Black South African politician and civil rights activist and lawyer Nelson Mandela as the country's first democratically elected Black president. He served for one term from 1994 to 1999. And has been then followed by some other politicians of the Socialist African National Congress. This had been preceded by years, even decades of unrest. Already back in the 1930s, if I remember correctly, even the last Black South African men had lost their right to vote. Although for certain parliamentary terms, they still could elect a few white spokesmen for them in the parliament. But when the National Party won the 1948 South African parliamentary elections, it started to institute an official policy aimed at the segregation or separation of the country's so-called racial groups: whites, blacks, coloreds, or people of mixed black and white ancestry, and Indians. And then, of course, there were ambiguous cases because, as we well know, these racial groupings are general, but certainly not precise groupings of people. To put a long story short, the apartheid policy became gradually stricter under a succession of prime ministers: Daniel Malan, then Hans or Johannes Strijdom, then Hendrik Verwoerd, after him Johannes Forster, and then the last hardline pro-apartheid South African Prime Minister was Peter Willem Botha, who in 1984, with the new constitution, became the state president, because the offices of President and Prime Minister were then merged. Interestingly enough, also in 1984, started South Africa's 10-year experiment with having a three-chamber parliament, with a separate chamber for the whites, who remained politically dominant, as well as socially and economically and educationally. Then one for the Indians, one for the coloreds. The Indians and coloreds had a couple of cabinet ministers. Generally speaking, the three-chamber parliament worked rather badly because the whites remained dominant. The blacks remained disenfranchised, although they did have a number of so-called homelands in the largely dry and infertile South African interior. In 1989, President Botha resigned. He was replaced by a more pragmatic politician who nevertheless did favor some kind of retention of the apartheid system, Mr. Frederick de Klerk. He belonged to the so-called Verlichte faction of the South African National Party, which favored practical adjustments in order to reduce the harsh excesses of the apartheid system while not necessarily renouncing any of its principles, such as the country's continued political domination by its white minority that was divided largely between the Afrikaners or Boers, descendants of Dutch immigrants who had started to come to South Africa in the 17th century, and then white South Africans of British descent. The protests grew, however, on the part of blacks and then on the part of also some other members of the country's racial groups. And finally, in February 1990, President de Klerk announced that the black South African politician, lawyer, and civil rights activist Nelson Mandela, who had been arrested in 1962 while re-entering the country, he had been seeking help for the country's oppressed black majority and had been sentenced to life imprisonment on Robben Island off the coast of Cape Town in southwestern South Africa in 1964. And with Mandela's release, it was clear that the white apartheid government under Frederick de Klerk was prepared to surrender power conditionally to the country's black majority. In the second half of 1991 started the CODISA, or Congress on Democracy in South Africa negotiations, which then paved the way at last in late April 1994 for the country's first democratic multiracial elections, where both the adult men and the adult women who were citizens of South Africa had the vote. There were those extremist white groups such as the Afrikaner Resistance Front, led by Eugène Terblanche, and he actually threatened to launch a racial war, but it didn't happen. Then there were controversial incidents, such as the one in, I think, March 1994, when 3 white members of the Afrikaner Resistance Front were executed by a black South African police officer. One of them was already severely injured. The other 2 were less injured, but had to nevertheless pay with their lives. Yes, I can summarize this. The Bophuthatswana crisis, which happened in northern South Africa. It began after Lucas Mangope, the president of Bophuthatswana, a South African Bantustan, nominally independent one, created under apartheid, attempted to crush widespread labor unrest and popular demonstrations, demanding the incorporation of that so-called homeland territory into South Africa, pending multi-racial elections later that year. The crisis took place on March the 11th, 1994. The government of Bophuthatswana and Afrikaner Volksfront and the Afrikaner Resistance Movement were opposing the BDF mutineers and South African Defense Forces. The Volksfront had 4,500 soldiers. The Afrikaner Resistance Movement had 600 soldiers. Their security forces had just over 10,000 soldiers. One Volksfront soldier was killed. 4 Afrikaner resistance movement soldiers were killed, with 3 wounded, while 50 of the BDF mutineers, or mutineers of the Bopultatswana defense forces, were killed and 285 were wounded. And the conflict's single most publicized events was the killing, in effect execution, of 3 wounded Afrikaner resistance movement members who were shot dead at point blank range in front of journalists, and their shooting can still be seen, I believe, on YouTube. In front of journalists by a Bopultatswana police constable, Ontlametse Bernstein Menyatsu. Afrikaner Resistance Front Colonel Alwin Wolfart, General Nicolas Fourie, and Field Cornet Jacobus Aus were driving a blue Mercedes-Benz W114 at the end of the Afrikaner Resistance Movement vehicle's convoy that had been firing into roadside houses. Members of the Bopultatswana Defense Force returned fire and hit the car's driver, Nicolas Fourie, in the neck, another gunman, Alwin Wolfart, in the arm, and the remaining passenger, Jacobus Aus, in the leg. Wolfart stumbled out of the car and brandished a handgun, but the onlookers advised him not to start shooting. A Bopultatswana police officer relieved him of the weapon. Another policeman tried to fire on nearby journalists, but his rifle jammed and was promptly confiscated. Ontlametse Menyatsu approached and spoke to Wolfart, asking if he was a member of the Afrikaner resistance movement. Wolfart admitted that he was, and then reported that they had been dispatched from Nabon's Prout. He then pleaded for his 2 injured fellows' lives. In response, Menyatsu shot the 3 wounded men dead at point-blank range with an R4, shouting angrily, "Who do you think you are? What are you doing in my country?" And obviously, such hardline Afrikaner pro-apartheid people as the Afrikaner resistance movement's leader, Eugène Terblanche, considered them basically as martyrs to the cause of Afrikaners and their so-called homeland. While the outgoing president, Frédéric de Klerk, did not condone such violence, he nevertheless believed, or he tried to institute a system where, yes, there would be democratic and free and multiracial elections. However, the provinces would have a wide degree of self-government. There would be a bicameral federal parliament where laws would have to be passed by especially high majorities. In other words, he tried to secure the group's rights, especially those of South Africa's white minority, in order to be able to appease those hardline Afrikaners who believed that he was basically selling them out and betraying them. Because under apartheid, the dominant view was that since the whites were more educated and therefore more civilized than the blacks, they had a right to rule over them. And for a long time, the Dutch Reformed Church, which was even nicknamed the National Party at Prayer because most of the National Party's members belonged to it, had basically taught, or at least condoned, the teaching that it was somehow God's will for the white minority, especially its Afrikaner component, to remain dominant. And the claim was made that the Afrikaners had basically Christianized the blacks, although, of course, also the British South Africans had had missionaries and other ministers of the gospel in their midst. And this somehow justified the continued oppression and virtual enslavement of the country's black majority. However, at last in the 1980s, even the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa started to turn against the apartheid rule. One of its bishops or other leading clergymen declared, this is from maybe a biography, either a biography of the late President Mandela or then a history of South Africa. There is no such thing as white superiority or black inferiority. All people are equal in the sight of God, which of course is the truth. But still, there are some white South Afrikaners who basically claim that blacks are more driven to communism and socialism, are more driven to anarchy, are more driven to irresponsible freedom and extreme democracy than are the whites, and therefore the system is evil and should be replaced by something else. What exactly they have in mind, I don't know. Yeah, some of them basically have separated themselves from the black majority insofar as it's still possible in the multiracial and democratic South Africa, and have moved to the country's more isolated regions where there aren't that many blacks. And yes, there have been controversial killings of white farmers and some of their family members, interestingly enough, also of some of their black South African employees or farmhands on the farms. One problem, of course, is the country's deep economic inequality, which means that many black South Africans still live in abject poverty. And since they know that the white South Africans are economically much more prosperous than they are on average, therefore they are tempted, or some of them are tempted, to rob those white farmers of money. And then some of them are still so driven by racial hatred that they are bent on killing those white farmers, or at least some of them, and some of their family members, and interestingly enough, also some of their non-white, mostly black farm servants. Most of those farms are in the isolated parts of the South African countryside. Of course, we should remember that there are relatively many members of all of the so-called racial groups, or actually a clear, if not a great majority, who want to live more or less in peace with each other. But extremists are, of course, found in every single ethnic and racial group in South Africa, just like in every other country of the world. Anyway, to put a long story short, to date, over 4,000 white South African farmers or their family members have been killed in these shootings or other murders on the country's farms. This doesn't mean, however, that there would be a potential genocide of the Boers or Afrikaners, because we have to remember that after all, they have a high standard of living. Most of them are no longer working as farmers. Here I have to take exception to one Finnish Lutheran/Calvinist theologian whom I will not name to protect his privacy, who claimed in one of his blog posts on an interdenominational evangelical and charismatic Finnish Missions Foundation's website in 2018, there supposedly was an upcoming genocide against the Afrikaners because of the land expropriation law, which in South Africa at least was due to enter into effect in August 2018. I'm afraid that he was exaggerating the situation. If we compare the white South African Boers or Afrikaner situation with that of many Christians in Nigeria, especially in the Muslim majority federal states of Nigeria. How about the oppressed peoples of Sudan and South Sudan? How about the war-torn Somalia? How about the oppressed peoples of Ethiopia and Eritrea? Let alone the oppressed Muslim minority of Myanmar or Burma, the Rohingya people. That there are far worse massacres and genocides occurring than the alleged massacre of Boers or Afrikaners. Besides, since Boers or Afrikaners are generally speaking rich, especially compared to the vast majority of Black South Africans, and they are well educated, they have connections abroad, they are free to leave their farms whenever they wish, at least technically, and then move to the cities where they will be more protected. And then a number of them have moved not just out of their farms, but even out of South Africa. In fact, Australia at some point during this decade even offered them an asylum. And then the same Finnish Christian theologian, who's also an apologist and a writer and a researcher, even claimed that the African National Congress is a communist party. This claim, unfortunately, is not factual. It is misleading. While there has been for decades, during the party's entire existence, a communist contingent in it, most voters and members of the African National Congress are not communists, but either socialists or social democrats. And then he referred to the fact that several years ago, then President of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, sang the song, "Kill the Boers." And yes, it is true that he did sing, and he certainly sinned by doing that. Certainly it was wrong. I think that song ought to be banned, especially because the apartheid doesn't exist anymore. Yeah, the song's lyrics, I may quote them. It's actually a brief song. It's a brief song, actually. Trying to find it somewhere. Here on the internet. Yeah, it's an old struggle song of the Black South African civil rights movement and therefore of the African National Congress. This website, www.apc.uct.ac.z or ZA. Projects archival platform, heritage or hate speech. Let's see. Still haven't found. Yeah, it's kill the boar, kill the farmer. Okay, I have to go to Prague or Prague.org. An apparently white South African website. And pro-Afrikaner website. Cowards are scared, shoot, 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 shoot. Cowards are scared, shoot, 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 shoot the boar, shoot, shoot, shoot the boar, shoot, shoot, shoot the boar, shoot, shoot. Mother, leave me be, oh mother, mother, leave me be, oh mother. And then shoot the boar. Cowards are scared, and so forth. Anyway, the African National Congress has dominated the South African politics, especially at the federal level, since the introduction of multiracial democracy there in 1994. And it has even held a majority of over 2/3 in the country's lower house of parliament, the National Assembly. Currently, it has 249 legislators out of 400. The official opposition, the liberally oriented Democratic Alliance, has 89 seats. The other parties hold 62 seats. There are, by a quick count, 11 other parties there. And then there's the National Council, which is the upper house of parliament, and has 90 seats. Its purpose is to represent the provinces' governments. So 90 provincial delegates, 10 delegates for each of the 9 provinces, regardless of the province's population. And the party representation in the delegation must proportionally reflect the provincial legislature's party representation, according to the South African Constitution's formula. Currently, the African National Congress holds 60 seats in the National Council. The Democratic Alliance has 20, and the other parties share the remaining 10 seats. New elections will take place in probably May 2019. According to the opinion polling, the African National Congress is likely to retain its large majority in the parliament. We will then see what happens. In the Afrikaans language article on these upcoming elections, according to an opinion poll made in in December 2018, the African National Congress would have 56% of the committed voters support. The Democratic Alliance would have 18%. The Economic Freedom Fighters would have 11%. The other parties 14%. And then abstinence, don't know or no answer, 1%. By contrast, in the Afrobarometer poll taken in October 2018, the African National Congress had 48% support, the Democratic Alliance 11%, likewise the Economic Freedom Fighters, the other parties 3%, and abstinence, don't know, no answer had 27%. South Africa is a curious mixture of parliamentarism and presidentialism in the sense that there's no separate prime minister, but each president also serves as the head of government. However, the parliament elects the president and also has the power to dismiss him. So in that sense, it is truly a parliamentary democracy. And in late 2017, the controversial president Jacob Zuma narrowly survived a non-confidence vote, or non-confidence motion, in the South African Federal Parliament, and then he eventually was forced to resign. He had been hounded for years by allegations of corruption. He had to resign in May 2018 to be replaced by Cyril Ramaphosa. In 2018, an estimated 57,726,000 people lived in South Africa, rounding its estimated population up to the nearest 1,000. Its estimated purchasing power parity gross domestic product was $13,840 or international dollars per capita in 2018. Its Gini index income inequality was 63.0, or very high. Its Human Development Index, and the Gini figure comes from 2014. Its Human Development Index comes from 2017 and is 0.699, or medium. Its currency is the South African rand. It has 9 provinces that have fairly wide self-government. Historically, the Western Cape province has been the heartland of the Democratic Alliance's support. Since 2004, South Africa has had many thousands of popular protests, some violent, making it, according to one academic, the world's most protest-rich country. In 2008, South Africa placed 5th out of 48 sub-Saharan African countries on the Ibrahim Index of African Governance, scoring well in the categories of rule of law, transparency and corruption, and participation in human rights. However, its safety and security performance was judged rather poor. In November 2006, South Africa became the first African country to legalize the same-sex marriage. Nearly 50 murders are committed each day in South Africa. Accordingly, middle-class South Africans seek security in gated communities. South Africa has also a high rape rate, with 43,195 rapes reported in 2014 to 2015. In 2019, a survey found 1 in 4 South African men admitting to raping someone. The incidence of child and infant rape is among the world's highest, largely as a result of the virgin cleansing myth, and a number of high-profile cases, sometimes as young as 8 months, have outraged the nation. Internationally, South Africa belongs, for example, to the African Union, to the African Union's new Partnership for Africa's Development, the Group of 77, the British Commonwealth of Nations, or simply the Commonwealth of Nations, the Southern African Development Community, the South Atlantic Peace and Cooperation Zone, the Southern African Customs Union, the Antarctic Treaty System, the World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, G20, G8+5, the Port Management Association of Eastern and Southern Africa, and of course the United Nations. The South African National Defense Force is an all-volunteer army. In other words, there is no compulsory military service in South Africa. South Africa's 9 provinces are the following: Eastern Cape, Free State, Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, Northwest, Northern Cape, and Western Cape. South Africa has a mixed economy. In other words, it's a mixture of free market economy and then state-owned corporations. After 1994, the South African government policy brought down inflation, stabilized public finances, and some foreign capital was attracted. However, growth was still subpar. From 2004, or since 2004, South Africa's economy has grown rather quickly. During Jacob Zuma's presidency, the government increased the role of state-owned enterprises, or SOEs. Some of the biggest SOEs are Eskom, the electric power monopoly, South African Airways, and Transnet, the railroad and ports monopoly. Some of these SOEs, however, have not been profitable. The South African Airways has required bailouts totaling 30 billion rand, or $2.25 billion over 20 years. South Africa attracts many tourists. It trades, besides other African countries, especially with Germany, the United States, China, Japan, Britain, and Spain. Several important scientific and technological developments have originated in South Africa. The first human-to-human heart transplant was performed by the cardiac surgeon Christian Barnard at Groote Schuur Hospital in December 1967. Max Tyler developed a vaccine against yellow fever. Alan MacLeod Cormack pioneered X-ray computed tomography. And Aaron Klug developed crystallographic electron microscopy techniques. In South Africa, there is free basic water and water boards, which are bulk water supply agencies operating pipelines and selling water from reservoirs to municipalities. Even though South Africa is surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean in the southwest, and then the Indian Ocean in the south and southeast, its water supply, however, is quite limited in the interior, partly because of the climate, partly also because of unseasonable droughts. In early 2018, Cape Town in southwestern South Africa faced a water crisis as the city's water supply was predicted to run before the end of June. Water-saving measures were in effect, requiring each citizen to use under 50 liters of water per day. South Africa is home to an estimated 5 million illegal immigrants, including some 3 million Zimbabweans. South Africa has, as a compromise to the country's various ethnic and racial groups, 11 official languages. Two of them are Indo-European, Afrikaans and English. In practice, English is the most widely spoken second language. The other 9 are then native or Black South African languages: Zulu, Xhosa, Northern Sotho, Tswana, Southern Sotho, Tsonga, Swazi, Venda, and Southern Ndebele. All the languages are formally equal, but some languages are naturally spoken more than others. According to the 2011 census, the 3 most spoken first languages in South Africa were Zulu, 22.7%, Xhosa, 16%, and Afrikaans, 13.5%. Only 9.6% of South Africans declared English to be their first spoken language. However, as a second spoken language, English is common, especially in commerce and science, and much of the media and education, especially the government-run schools. The country also recognizes several unofficial languages, including Fanagalo, Khoi, Lobedu, Nama, Northern Ndebele, Puti, and South African Sign Language. South Africa has 3 capitals: Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Pretoria. Religion has been a contentious topic in South Africa. Despite the fact that it recognizes the same-sex marriage, it is, at least as far as the number of official adherents is concerned, a rather highly religious country. In 2010, according to a survey, 73.2%, or almost 3/4 of South Africans, were Protestants. 14.9%, or about 1/7, declared no religion. Catholics numbered 7.4%, Muslims 1.7%, Hindus 1.1%, and members of other religions 1.7%. The major Christian churches include Zion Christian Church, 11.1%, Pentecostal or Charismatic churches, 8.2%, Roman Catholic Church, 7.1%, Methodist Church, 6.8%, Dutch Reformed, 6.7%, and Anglican Church, 3.8%. The remaining Christian churches members accounted for another 36% of the population in 2001. African-initiated churches formed the Christian group's largest churches. The South African black majority still has a substantial number of rural inhabitants who lead largely impoverished lives. However, as blacks have become increasingly urbanized and westernized, aspects of traditional culture have declined. Members of the middle class, who are predominantly white, but whose ranks include growing numbers of black, colored, and Indian people, have lifestyles similar in many respects to those of people found in Western Europe, North America, and Australasia. And South Africa has a number of well-known celebrities, such as the model and actress Pearl Thusi. South Africa also is home to a former Paralympic athlete. In other words, having amputated feet amputated in childhood, but using then artificial legs. Oscar Pistorius, who tragically, on the early morning hours of Valentine's Day, February the 14th, 2013, shot dead his girlfriend of some 3 months. The model Riva Steenkamp, who had been in 2012 one of the participants to the Tropica Island competition, which included several celebrities such as Steenkamp and then several ordinary South Africans. Yes, Tropica Island of Treasure. By 2015, 1.4 million students in higher education in South Africa have benefited from a financial aid scheme, which was promulgated in 1999. In 2004, South Africa had started reforming its tertiary education system, merging and incorporating small universities into larger institutions and renaming all tertiary education institutions as universities. AIDS is still a problem in South Africa. As of 2015, according to the United Nations AIDS report, South Africa had an estimated 7 million people living with HIV, more than any other country in the world at the time. About 84% or 5/6 of South Africans depend on the public healthcare system, which, however, is beset with chronic human resource shortages and limited resources. In other words, there aren't enough qualified medical doctors or nurses for the patients. About 20% of the population uses private healthcare, and only 16% or 1/6 of the population is covered by medical aid schemes. The rest pay for private care out of pocket or through in-hospital-only plans. The three dominant hospital groups, Mediclinic, Life Healthcare, and Netcare, together control 75% of the private hospital market. South Africa is home to the third largest hospital in the world, the Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital. The life expectancy in South Africa as of 2015 was 62.5 years, brought down by many impoverished Black South Africans' short lifespans.